The Arab Spring, which began in late 2010, inspired Syrians to rise against decades of autocratic rule under the Assad family. Bashar al-Assad, who took power in 2000 following the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, ruled a tightly controlled state. While the regime maintained a veneer of modernization, its governance was marked by political repression, economic inequality, and corruption. In March 2011, protests erupted in the southern city of Daraa after the arrest and torture of several schoolchildren who had written anti-government graffiti. The government responded with extreme force, killing demonstrators and inflaming public anger. The violence turned small protests into a nationwide movement as Syrians demanded political reforms, an end to corruption, and greater freedoms. Syria's sectarian makeup played a crucial role in the crisis. The ruling Assad family belongs to the Alawite sect, a minority Shia offshoot, while the majority of Syrians are Sunni Muslims. This sectarian divide became a fault line as the conflict deepened. The regime relied heavily on support from Alawite elites and Shia allies like Iran and Hezbollah. The opposition drew much of its strength from Sunni majority areas, but it also included secular and nationalist groups. Minority groups such as Kurds, Christians, and Druze often sought to avoid entanglement in the conflict or pursued their own political objectives. The protests, initially non-sectarian, soon morphed into a fragmented conflict with overlapping ethnic, sectarian, and ideological dimensions. The regime's brutal response to peaceful protests, including mass arrests, indiscriminate killings, and torture, pushed opposition groups to take up arms. By mid-2012, the conflict had escalated into a full-blown civil war, with various factions controlling different parts of the country. The opposition coalesced into groups like the Free Syrian Army, which aimed to overthrow Assad. However, the lack of unity among rebel factions made the opposition fragmented and vulnerable to infighting. The Syrian conflict quickly attracted regional and international powers, each pursuing its own interests. Russia, a staunch ally of Assad, provided military and diplomatic support, including airstrikes starting in 2015 to protect the regime and secure its naval base in Tartus. Iran viewed Assad as a critical ally in its regional axis of resistance against Israel and the West. Iran provided financial aid, weapons, and proxy militias, including Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon. The United States, initially hesitant to intervene, later supported Kurdish forces and moderate rebel factions to combat ISIS. Turkey, opposed to Assad, supported Sunni rebel groups and later launched military operations against Kurdish forces near its border. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, these Gulf states funded Sunni rebel groups to counter Iranian influence in Syria. Bashar al-Assad's government maintained control over Damascus and key urban centers. The regime used a combination of conventional and unconventional tactics, including chemical weapons, sieges, and indiscriminate bombing, to crush opposition. The opposition was highly fragmented, with factions ranging from moderate rebels to hardline Islamist groups. Prominent players included the Free Syrian Army, a loose coalition of defected soldiers and civilians; Islamist groups like Ara al-Sham and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which sought to establish an Islamic state; Kurdish groups, led by the Syrian Democratic Forces and the YPG, sought autonomy in northern Syria, also known as Rojava. With US support, they played a key role in defeating ISIS. The Islamic State, or ISIS, emerged as a major force in 2014, seizing large parts of Syria and Iraq. The group declared a caliphate and imposed a brutal regime before being largely defeated by 2019. The Assad regime was accused of using chemical weapons against civilians on multiple occasions, including the 2013 Ghouta attack that killed hundreds. Despite international outrage, Assad remained in power due to Russian diplomatic intervention, which averted US military action by brokering a deal to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. Aleppo, Syria's largest city and a major battleground, fell to regime forces in 2016 after months of devastating airstrikes and a brutal siege. This marked a turning point in the war, solidifying Assad's hold on key territory. By 2019, ISIS had lost most of its territory thanks to a US-led coalition and Kurdish forces. However, the group continues to operate as an insurgency. The Syrian civil war has caused immense human suffering, making it one of the worst humanitarian crises of the modern era. Over 600,000 people have been killed since 2011, including thousands of children. 6.7 million Syrians have been internally displaced, and another 6.6 million have fled as refugees to neighboring countries and beyond. Entire cities, including Aleppo, Raqqa, and Homs, have been reduced to rubble. Hospitals, schools, and essential services have been systematically targeted. The refugee crisis has overwhelmed neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Europe has also faced political and social challenges from the influx of Syrian refugees. All sides in the conflict have been accused of war crimes, including chemical attacks, massacres, and the targeting of civilians. The Assad regime's use of barrel bombs and siege tactics has been particularly condemned. The Syrian crisis became a proxy war for regional powers. Iran expanded its influence through its support for Assad and proxy militias. Turkey sought to prevent the rise of Kurdish autonomy while expanding its military presence. Syria became a theater for great power competition. Russia used the conflict to reassert itself as a global power and secure its interests in the Middle East. The United States aimed to combat ISIS while avoiding deeper entanglement. Efforts by the United Nations to broker peace through initiatives like the Geneva process have largely failed due to the intransigence of key players and vetoes by Russia and China at the Security Council. The war created the largest displacement crisis since World War II, with over 13 million Syrians displaced. The city of Raqqa, once the de facto capital of ISIS, was 90% destroyed during its liberation. The Assad regime has been accused of committing over 300 chemical attacks since 2012. Syria's GDP has shrunk by more than 75%, plunging millions into poverty. While large-scale fighting has subsided, Syria remains fragmented. Idlib province remains under rebel control, with frequent clashes between HTS and regime forces. Kurdish regions in the northeast face continued pressure from Turkey. Reconstruction efforts have been hindered by sanctions, corruption, and a lack of international funding. In December 2024, reports of renewed violence and displacement in northwest Syria underscore the fragility of the situation. The Syrian crisis is a tragic testament to the complexities of modern warfare, where local grievances intersect with regional and global rivalries. Despite the regime's military victories, Syria remains deeply divided, with millions of its people suffering the consequences. The conflict has reshaped the Middle East, weakened international norms, and highlighted the failures of global governance in addressing humanitarian crises. As the world looks to the future, the need for a sustainable political solution and accountability for war crimes remains paramount.